We all want our gardens to be full of colour and crops and flowers, but so often we have some unwanted visitors as well. And for that, I mean weeds. One definition of a weed is simply a plant growing in the wrong place. It's something growing where you don't want it. But other times, just natural wildflowers and other plants we know as weeds start growing up in our borders. We've got a big thistle growing up at the back of a border here. And it's important when you're hand weeding to get these out, root and all. Sometimes it's worth using a little trowel when you're hand weeding because some weeds will regrow if you leave any root in the ground. It's the sort of thing to do and potter around the garden, a couple of times a week if you can. Something else it's worth doing is getting yourself a hoe. And any bare areas of soil you've got, just run the hoe lightly over the soil surface to cut through any weed seedlings which are coming up. And leave these on the soil surface to dry out. And once the border is weed free, you want to stop any new weeds growing. And this is where mulching is a great technique for gardeners to use. And a mulch is just a layer of organic material, homemade compost, bags of compost, or something like this bark material here, which you can spread onto the soil quite generously and deeply. They often think there's a layer at least 5 to 7 centimetres, 2 to 3 inches deep, is going to be best for stopping any annual weed seeds growing. This acts as a lovely coating over the soil surface. Also looks nice, it looks attractive, and it locks in moisture too. You might rather use a weed barrier sheet. Now this is a fabric material which you spread out onto your borders. Cut up strips if you want, lay it down between plants, and it stops any weeds growing up through it but lets the rain through. And you can just spread it over bare areas between plants and put a bark mulch on top of this to cover it so it looks ornamental. Or use ordinary newspaper, keep it several layers thick and lie this onto the soil surface. Once it's in place, moisten it so it forms a sodden mass, and then cover that with a bark mulch instead. And that helps suppress and stop weeds growing through. You'll find that there are other much more troublesome weeds in the garden that are perennial and come up year after year. And one in particular is this one, bindweed, that grows up and twines up the stems of shrubs and plants around the garden. But if we delve deeply below soil level, you'll notice that this particular weed forms a complete network of white roots. And we've got to take every single piece of this out of soil. If you leave one little piece in the ground, a new weed will develop. We've got to be, it's hard work, just going over and over, sieving it out and removing the weeds piece by piece. But if bindweed is growing up among other plants in your borders, it's much more difficult to control. Like here, the bindweed's growing up through some plants and using the stems of these flowering bulbs for support. So it's time to get on your gardening gloves and get out the weed killer. And the one I'm going to use for this job is a special gel formulation of Roundup, and dab gel onto as many leaves of the weed as you can, taking great care not to touch any of the plants around which you're trying to keep in your border, because any plant that the weed killer touches will be killed. The active ingredient in the gel will be absorbed by the leaf and taken down into the roots and kill the weed from the root upwards. Within a few days, you notice that the weed will be wilting and the whole weed will be dead, and when the tops are dead, you can pull them away. But weeds don't just grow in the borders, they also grow in the cracks in paths and drives and patios. The easiest way to get rid of them is literally by hand. Get yourself a weeding tool like this and scrape them out completely, root and all. It's quite hard work going over the whole area, but it does the job. If you want an easier option, get yourself a path and patio weeder. Spot treat individual weeds, leaves and all. Let them die down naturally before you remove the remains. If you've got a larger area to treat, perhaps you've got a gravel drive or some pebbles, buy a path and patio weed killer that can be dissolved in a watering can. Get yourself a special red can just for using for weed killers. Mix it up, dissolve it in, and treat the whole area, weeds and all. Let the weed killer soak right the way down into the gaps. And this will not only kill the weeds which are there, but it will stop any others growing, usually for the whole season. So this is a job to do early in the year to stop any weeds growing up and keep your paths and drives and patios completely weed free for the whole year. So there you have it, different techniques you can use to control weeds around your garden. Hand weeding and hoeing, mulching, spot treating weeds, or areas like this can be treated with a weed killer to keep them pristine all year round.